Hello once again for my online summer 2019 classes. We're on now to Chapter 7, the media. This is the second chapter in the second set of chapters that we're covering for our second exam. And something that I would imagine all of us to some degree are using every day, or at least we're in contact with people who are using this every day. The media, Chapter 7. This is from the beginning of your chapter, and the need for media in a democracy. This comes from Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, third President of the United States. And were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. So we get a sense there that Jefferson views the importance of the main form of the media at the time of his life, newspapers, but the need then that if used properly, the media can inform citizens and can also limit the power of government and provide more opportunities and freedom for individuals. And there's a power and responsibility of the media. We can go back to Edward Snowden. We've talked about him on a few other occasions already in this class. But the idea of being able to go to the media to expose the problems or abuses in government is very powerful, and we can certainly see that there are times in which it's important. Can that privilege or that power be abused as well? And is it best for us to know most, if not everything, that the government may be doing? Or are there situations in which we as private citizens, individuals, should not necessarily know all the activities of the government? That's a very serious and broad question, and one that may not be easy or perhaps even possible to fully answer. But the question there of what is the responsibility overall of the media? And then also the question on what is newsworthy. This is a few years old, of course, but it was certainly a great example when it came out, this whole story, to put it on the front cover of a fairly well-known magazine, and to say, is this really that important of a story to look at a famous athlete who has now gone through a sex change? I think all I would say for you, the individual watching this recorded lecture, is for you to make your own analysis on whether or not you could see a reason why this would in fact be a newsworthy story, to the point of even having it on the front page of the magazine. If you were an editor, for example, of Vanity Fair, could you make a strong argument that it should be actually a front page and a cover story? Or would you ultimately conclude there's not a good enough reason to put it on the front page? So in large part, what our media is about in the United States, and perhaps any country where the media is largely consumed by private matters, that it's either you sell advertising or you have to outright buy the news source, means that it's a mixture of information and entertainment, is what people are willing to pay for, ultimately entertainment. There are some arguments made that forms of the media, such as television, can only be entertainment. And so there we have the mixture of infotainment, information, and entertainment. Well, the media in large part in the United States, and you'll see this there in your text, is owned by a few major corporations. And so the mass media, the internet, television, and from that then still to this day, newspapers and magazines are largely owned by just a few major corporations. Like other aspects of our commercial life in the United States, we do have still a few companies that have extraordinary power. And so here is the big media, the corporations that own almost all of it, really, and increasingly every year seem to own even more. And so this is the term media monopoly that you'll see on page 260 in your text. And these are the corporations that divide up the media pie pretty much all to themselves. And what I would urge you to do is just make a note, perhaps even pause the recording and look at these corporations and see what part that they own. And notice that this is in italics, like other areas where we put it in, where I put it in italics. It means that you don't directly get this from the textbook. Technology has changed, and so, for example, some of the major newspapers in America, both major newspapers in Chicago, the Chicago Sun-Times that you can see a picture of here, and then its competitor, Chicago Tribune, both of these newspapers stopped or laid off their photographers and just started to have the reporters use their own cell phones to take pictures or to get pictures from citizens. And we know that so many people have access to phones that can take photographs, and so it's changed, the technology has changed the corporate structure or the workforce at both of these newspapers, and you have to assume with many other newspapers across America. So it was led to having citizens cover the news, and they can take their own photographs. Now, perhaps here we have a few newspaper photographers in this event, but also people just capturing it on their phones. And this was a protest, a student protest in California, and protesting tuition increases. And here you have a police officer trying to break up the protest by using pepper spray. And so the police officer started to be referred to as the pepper spray cop. There's other examples of citizen journalism that you see here on these pages, 271 to 273. This police officer and other events that are captured by the public can create memes, and many of you are quite familiar with memes. They're a humorous image copied, usually altered, and spread rapidly by the internet users, and that can certainly be the case in our world today. It does raise the question, just because an event happens in the public and the individual did something publicly, but in this case the police officer did something publicly in the scope of his job. But nevertheless, does that mean that this individual can now be part of someone else's humorous meme? And we have some examples here. So here's the pepper spray cop with My Little Pony. The pepper spray cop with Maria from Sound of Music. And so does it mean that he no longer has an ability to control his image once something's been done in the public? Would that mean the same for any one of us? Big question there about technology and what it means to us as private individuals. Here we can just look at the evolution of the power of the media and the different changes. A lot of it's connected to technology. So here we can see the partisan press, meaning that this was a time in the early stages, late 1700s, early part of the United States history, part of the United States government and the country of the United States, that the technology was such in which it was labor intensive to put a paper together. And so in that case, it took a lot of time, and it was not necessarily very productive when it comes to finances. commercially successful. Not that many people could read or have access to papers. And so that's why the political parties, the partisan press, would own the newspapers. And that started to, so they would really, it was a method of getting their word out, not so much covering the truth or even attempting to do that. And so that started to change with the changes in technology. So in the 1800s, when you started to get the rotary press, you started to get the locomotive and uses of the telegraph and other types of technologies, you could see more stories, more newspapers being produced, people being able to have access to the newspapers, perhaps having an opportunity to read a newspaper and having the ability to read a newspaper. And that became an era of competitiveness among the newspapers. Many cities would have more than one or two newspapers. It was not unheard of to have cities that would have 8,000 people living in them and maybe have 3 newspapers. Well, today, a city of 8,000 might be fortunate to have one newspaper that's published a couple of times a week. But this is the golden age of the newspapers. In the 1800s and up until really about the 1920s or 30s, and you would have young boys, perhaps, generally would be the case, that would be the newsies that would be out there in the major cities trying to sell their newspapers. So you would have had somewhere around 10 or 12 daily newspapers in New York City. And so these newsies would have had that opportunity to get out there and compete and work for one particular newspaper, New York Tribune, New York Post, New York Sun, and try to get people to buy that paper. This also opened up the situation in which you would have marginal truth to the stories that were being published. And so you had journalistic sensationalism, oftentimes referred to as yellow journalism. A lot of that was associated with this cartoon, the Yellow Boy. So you can see here one of the first colored cartoons in a newspaper, and had its own humor that may not necessarily translate well for us today. And also another argument for our origin for yellow journalism was that it was a cheap news pulp and paper pulp, and it would yellow faster as a result, and so therefore you would call it yellow journalism. So sensationalist stories, part of it's true, the rest of it they fill in the blanks with their own speculation, the newspaper writers, and attract more people to a particular story with fabrications or exaggerations. And this was led to some very terrible circumstances. There are some major changes in our society and our history. The Spanish-American War, probably the best known example, where newspapers exaggerated the events or speculated on what caused the events, in this case particularly the explosion and the killing of several hundred sailors and Marines on board the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, Cuba, which at that time was a territory of Spain. And this directly led to the Spanish-American War, as more people were getting fired up about the fact that this battleship did in fact explode and it did in fact sink in Cuban territory. But the speculation was who was responsible and what caused the explosion. Investigations by the U.S. Navy several years later concluded that it was not from Spain and it was not a torpedo, but an accident on board the ship that led to the explosion. But these were a couple of the major newspaper men who were pushing for the war, and they were putting that together in their newspapers, a lot of people reading about it, and getting, again, some speculation, exaggeration about events, yellow journalism, that caused people to want to support going to war with Spain. There's a fantastic movie, one of the best movies that's ever been made. It's worth your time to watch it, that really shows the power of a newspaper leader in getting stories out there and getting people attracted to a particular event and changing their whole way of thinking as a result. Citizen Kane, and most people who watch this movie and study the history that's being described in this movie are being followed, and makes it very similar to the actual life of William Randolph Hearst. Some other things that the media may do that we still see today, there may be a case of pack journalism, the tendency for the press to cover the same stories, and the whole O.J. Simpson event and saga and trial is a good example of this, where the media would come forward and start to cover a particular aspect of the O.J. Simpson trial or some coverage of the murder, and other newspapers and other news organizations would then cover that same story. And so everyone would start to cover this because they would say, editors of particular organizations, we need to cover it because everyone else is covering it. And so there you have a great example of pack journalism. We're starting to see, anytime you get into a campaign season, and of course we're still 18 months or so away from the next presidential election, and yet we start to already now see horse race journalism, who's ahead or who's behind. And while this does serve a purpose and it is important, we can also see the horse race journalism, the tendency of the media to just focus on this, and that is to look at a campaign and say, well, who's winning, who's losing? And that becomes the main story. So what's happening in the position of the candidates, which is important, but that would supersede the substance of these campaigns in many ways. And so there's some of the criticism of focusing so much on horse race journalism. We also see the power of the media when it comes to political campaigns, when it comes to American government in this regard, and that is, if you want to be a candidate, you certainly need to have some connections with the media. You need to be covered by the media. And so as the gatekeeper role for the media, it's in large part the media that decides who will be covered. It's the media that decides who gets to participate in a campaign. So we certainly see that candidates of the two major political parties, and we'll cover political parties when we get to Chapter 9, but we also see the role of the media in deciding who within those political parties gets to be covered. So we will see next week, if you're interested, there'll be presidential candidate debates on two nights, the 26th and the 27th, and there'll be 10 candidates, and for both these nights, 10 separate candidates on the two nights, and 20 candidates running for the nomination of the Democratic Party to run for president in 2020. Now, these are not the only candidates. There were 4 candidates that did not make the threshold to be on these debates. Now, it was mainly the political party itself that made that decision, but we have to assume that the media, to some degree, was willing to have these kind of parameters to decide who would be participating and who would not. And these are the rules to qualify for these first 2 debates. You have to get at least 1% in the polling, and that's from 18 separate polling firms. You have to have at least 65,000 donors, with at least 200 donors from 20 separate states. And so we can see here that in many ways the way to raise so much money today, it's really kind of interesting. We'll be seeing this in Chapter 8 and Chapter 10 as well, to look at the importance of using online facilities to be able to reach people and to get donors in that way. And that has given opportunities for people who perhaps are not that well known in traditional media forms to be able to get out there and compete. But not everybody made these qualifications. Another way of looking at the media, or the power of the media, is investigative journalism, and it's referred to as muckraker or muckraking, the activity itself. So in large part, this involves media going undercover, taking a separate role, and then writing about those activities. So instead of interviewing meat packers, and here we can see a picture of the meat packing industry and the people working in the meat packing industry in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a very demanding job, a dangerous job. You would have a reporter that would, instead of just interviewing the people doing the job, they would do the job as well. And they would find out then what it was like in that particular work. Or, for example, instead of interviewing people who own an apartment complex, again, a tenement apartment, late 1800s, early 1900s, in places like Chicago or New York City, have the investigative reporter pose as someone who wants an apartment and then lives in that apartment and see what it's like. Just what are the conditions like? What's it like to breathe that air? How loud is it? How do you have some way of knowing how to get out if you need to? And that would be the purpose then of muckraking. But it does mean that you're not being entirely honest. You perhaps get a story by posing as someone else. And we can see that that still happens today. Perhaps some of you have watched this show on television, To Catch a Predator, where men who are trying to set up dates with young people, generally I think on the show young girls, maybe 14 or 15-year-olds, and they're much older than that, and communicated with these young girls online. But somebody, to get this story, was not being honest. But is the purpose of getting the story so important that the dishonesty is something that can be overlooked? And so that's a modern form of muckraking. One of the best known novels that was created to highlight the events of muckraking, of people going into a business and then writing about what that business was like, and in this case putting it together in the form of a novel, is the novel The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. And Sinclair writes about the life of workers in slaughterhouses and meat processing plants. He had hoped that he could change the lifestyle of the workers in those plants, very demanding, dangerous, and can be, at that time, life-shortening for many people because of the demands that would take place physically. Well, some of that happened, but mainly what his story was able to change was the safety of the meat for consumers. And there were several stories in this novel that suggest that the meat may not necessarily be that safe for people in the way that it's processed. Now, this is at a time in the, again, late 1800s and early 1900s. But it was a case of really changing people's viewpoints of this particular business and the way people worked in that business. Another issue not brought out in your text is just to consider the power of the media and how we interpret that power of the media. In this case, dealing with what does it mean for people who watch a great deal of TV. Again, you can go back and think of your own analysis of your own lifestyle and consider how much television you watch per day. And When you watch television, it may very well mean that your opportunity to do other things is now reduced. But it could be by watching TV, depending on what you're watching, you might actually be informed. And so that's part of the question about this hypothesis. What a hypothesis is a prediction. So as you can see here, the prediction is the more you watch, the less you know. But perhaps it is not really fair about television. Maybe it's the programming of people who choose to watch a lot of television. Some people may watch a great deal of television, but they watch very informative shows, and that may mean that they're actually quite informed. Here we can see, going back directly to some of the key terms in your text, to look at the power of the media in this way. Look at framing, for example, the power of the media to influence how events and issues are interpreted. And that's on page 282 in your text. And depending on what media you choose to use, you may have different interpretations of events. Take, for example, the Affordable Care Act, the expansion of health care benefits. Well, it depends on what you're watching, on whether or not you feel that overall, whether or not you feel like that is a good choice to take, a good matter to follow. So if it's referred to as healthcare reform, you're probably more supportive of it. If it's healthcare rationing, increasingly less so. And if you're watching a program that refers to the Affordable Care Act or references it as a death panel, then it's more than likely you're not very supportive of that particular proposed law, which is also now Obamacare and is still the law of the United States. Then you have priming, and this is preparing the public. So just think about priming. If you see those old-fashioned pumps to get the water, you have to pump it a few times, and so that would be the case here. You're preparing the public for a particular view, an event to take place. So war with Iraq, for example. Are you preparing the public for that? Different stories that are coming out. Is that happening right now as you're watching news? If you occasionally watch the news or you know of family members that do, and we hear about some event in Iran or Venezuela, is this a case of the government trying to prepare us for particular actions? And so that's where you can see again the power of the media. And that leads us to this question about war. What is the responsibility or the role of the media during a time of war? So what's the greater morality? We see the issue of morality being brought up here in this chapter on the media. So in this case, when it comes to war, what's the morality? To report the truth or support your country? And what if in the process of reporting the truth, it means that you're actually providing less support for the country? Because perhaps there's a story out there that does not necessarily put the American military in a very positive light. Should it still be reported that way? There we can see part of the dilemma involved in the use of the media. And that certainly became the issue during the Vietnam War, and this is brought out in your text, so certainly focus on those issues. The longer the war went on, there was less support for the war, or less a viewpoint among reporters that they needed to support the United States government's point of view, that they needed to support a position that would create a positive viewpoint for the military. And so if they reported stories such as this one, this is, to be specific, known as the My Lai massacre, that would make people not very supportive of the military or supportive of the expansion or the use of the war in Vietnam, the reporters would ultimately conclude that they needed to just report the truth. even if it did make some issues not as positive as they previously had been. And so here we can see the power of the media on just setting the agenda. What should be some of the big stories that are out there? And issues on fighting drugs, perhaps fighting health issues. We can see there that the media is bringing out a particular point of view to follow. And so we're reminded of the power of the media in that case. All right, we'll stop there, and our next chapter will be chapter 8, and we'll look at political participation.